I could hear this crack, 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 bum, 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 crack, 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 bum, bum, bum. And I didn't think anything of it. And then one of the DS, the directing staff, came over and looked at us and said, "What the hell are you doing up there? Don't you realise that there are live rounds passing just feet over your head? You better get down here pronto."
This is Cold War Conversations. If you're new here, you've come to the right place to listen to first-hand Cold War history accounts. Do make sure you follow us in your podcast app so that you don't miss out on future episodes. Chris is a former member of the Yorkshire Volunteers, part of Cold War Britain's Territorial Reserve Army. This episode is a treasure trove of personal anecdotes, historical insights and reflections on military life, making it a must-listen for anyone interested in military history and the Cold War era. Chris's journey into the military began with an interest in military subjects and history. He joined the Army Cadet Force before university and later the Officer Training Corps at Sheffield University. As a reserve unit, he was trained on handling World War II vintage weapons, including the venerable Bren gun. He recalls an incident at the School of Infantry in Warminster where he inadvertently came under live fire. Despite his initial lack of physical prowess, Chris's perseverance and dedication saw him through, eventually leading to his decision to pursue a commission as an officer. Looking back, Chris reflects on the camaraderie, the challenges and the humorous moments that defined his military service. We also discuss the reality of PTSD, sharing insights from Chris's friend who served in Iraq. I'm delighted to welcome Chris to our Cold War conversation.
Our regiment was disbanded in the 90s, and it was the Yorkshire Volunteers, which was a territorial regiment, obviously from Yorkshire. And it's now the 4th Battalion, the Yorkshire Regiment.
Yeah, a lot of the regiments were disbanded when the peace dividend, I think it was described as, came in. So you were born in 1954. So as you were growing up, were you aware of the Cold War?
I think I was very aware of it, really, because I can remember the Berlin Wall going up. And I can remember the Cuban Missile Crisis and how worried my mother particularly was that a nuclear war might kick off. And then later on, my awareness grew, and I was aware of the 6-Day War in the Middle East, and I was aware that it was in some ways a proxy war between East and West, but. I was quite aware of the fact that there was what we considered a Soviet threat, and that the Soviet forces were very much bigger than NATO's, facing us in Germany.
Was there a history in your family of people serving in the armed forces?
Not a very great or illustrious history, really. My paternal grandfather served for pretty much all of World War I. He'd been a reservist at the time when war broke out, and he ended up in Bologna in October 1914 and served with the Royal Engineers in their Signals Division, which was subsequently to become the Royal Corps of Signals. We only know this because of photographs of him, but he served right until the end of the war, and unfortunately he became unemployed during the Great Depression and got a job working in the coal mine, and he was badly crushed in a pitfall and died of pneumonia about a week later in 1931. And my father did his national service from 1947 to 1949 with the Royal Air Force, and my Uncle John served with the Royal Marines. He was Normandy on D+3, manning a landing craft, I believe. Both dead now, unfortunately, so I can't ask them much more about it.
Well, that's not a bad family military history there. I think you've undersold yourself there a little bit, Chris.
Yeah, well, my father served in Hawaii with the Berlin Airlift, because in 1948 he was a radio operator, and he told me about the amount of radio traffic that they had to handle when that was all on.
Oh, okay. Yeah, Berlin Airlift. I do want to cover more of that on the podcast. But anyway, sorry, I'm cogitating while I'm asking questions here. So, what attracted you to joining the Territorial Army?
I'd always been interested in military subjects and military history, and for the 2 years before I went to university, I was in the Army Cadet Force, and when I went to Sheffield University, I saw the officer training course stand at Freshers Week, and then I decided to join up again. And so, yeah, I joined the OTC as an officer cadet, and I was very aware of the Soviet threat, as I say, and I wanted to play a part if I could. And also, I thought it might just be a lot of fun, which it was.
What year was this that you signed up?
1973, October 1973. So, yeah, that was a pretty low point, I think, looking back in the British Army's defences. You know, they'd wound things down significantly, and we had an enormous commitment in Northern Ireland at the time. So the British Army on the Rhine wasn't very strong at that time. But it didn't bother me so much because I joined the Officer Training Corps and subsequently the Territorial Army more with a view to defending British territory than to serve in Germany. You know, I was very keen to be in the local home guard, as it were.
So home defence based rather than overseas based.
Quite, yes.
And you know, when you joined the cadet force, what was the training like for that?
It wasn't bad, actually. You got issued with the old battle dress, you know, of the World War II and 1950s vintage, but that was mainly for best, you know, for parades, and we also got issued with coveralls for general use when we were just scrambling about the countryside. We were trained on the old weapons, on the number 4 rifle and the Bren gun. What else did I do in those days? Gosh. I know I became a lance corporal, you know, dizzy heights, and they trained us in section manoeuvres and to a lesser extent in platoon manoeuvres. But we were trained to operate a section, which at that time had I think it was a 2 or 3 man gun group, and the rest was 7, I think, at that time. I think they told us at that time that sections were 10 man strong. And so we knew in principle how to work by fire and maneuver and to take out maybe a couple of enemy riflemen. I was quite good on the weapons. In fact, I impressed our sergeant major because he asked me to do naming of parts and I knew every one of them. And he had to catch me out. He said, "What about the stacking swivel?" I said, "I don't think we use those anymore." So, but he had to try and catch me out on something. I liked the Bren too. I always have done. So we had the Bren in the Territorial Army subsequently, and those were the weapons that we worked on. I did once fire the SLR, the self-loading rifle, on a range, and I was to become much more familiar with that weapon later on. But yeah, the Army Cadet Force was pretty good. I enjoyed myself a lot in that.
You went to Sheffield University in 1973. You joined the Officer Training Corps. What was the training like as far as, you know, becoming an officer?
It was very good, in my opinion, because we got trained within the Officer Training Corps itself. And if you wanted to be an officer, you got extra training because you did the Certificate of Military Training. It was an examination-based system and using TUTS, tactical exercises without troops. And so I kept chopping and changing. I couldn't make my mind up. I was young at the time. I was in late teens, early 20s, and I couldn't make my mind up whether I wanted to be an officer or not. So I did the CMT, Certificate of Military Training. Also went to Warminster for a couple of weeks, the School of Infantry. And there we spent quite long days and nights exercising and taking lectures. And we got lots of stuff thrown at us about artillery and infantry tank corporation. And we spent a lot of time scurrying across the exercise ground. And I think it was at that point, at one time, I came under live fire inadvertently because we were coming down this valley, and I can't recall anybody mentioning to us that there would be live overhead fire. Well, it wasn't really overhead, it was off to our right, but it was there from a GPMG, so that we would get familiar with the sound of the crack and thump. And my section commander sent me with the gun group up onto the top of a bank, which was a pretty good position, admittedly, because we commanded a wide field of fire. And I could hear this crack, 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 bum, 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 crack, 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 bum, bum, bum. And I didn't think anything of it. And then one of the DS, the directing staff, came over and looked at us and said, "What the hell are you doing up there? Don't you realise that there are live rounds passing just feet over your head? And you better get down here pronto." So I said, "Okay, guys, let's go down again, but make sure that you just roll down." And so we did that. And yeah, that was the closest I ever came in my life to being under live fire. It was quite an experience.
I can imagine that could have been a very short army career there.
It could indeed. Thinking back, I was quite an unlikely candidate for an army officer, because it would certainly have surprised my PT master at school, because I wasn't very fit and I wasn't very strong. I was rather uncoordinated, and I was the kind of guy who generally got picked last for any kind of team. But I persevered, and in my last 2 years at school, I'd pretty much given up on playing the team sports. I was too small to be any good at rugby, and which I did enjoy rugby, but I was too slight for it. So I just ran and ran and ran, and that actually put me in quite good stead, because what you really need in the army, as much as anything else, is sheer stamina. It's more about stamina than anything else. And I also took up fencing before I went to university, and carried on with it at university, and that greatly improved my coordination as well. So yeah, I had the necessary skills, even though I wasn't a great sportsman, which is what the army liked. They really like to have the captains of the rugby team and the football team and boxers and such people like that. I wasn't any of that, but I did have the stamina and the coordination by the time I joined up.
How did your decision lie with regard to continuing to move on to being an officer?
Well, let's see. I was doing the CMT and Warminster in 74, 75. And I decided at that time I didn't really want the responsibility of being an army officer, even a territorial army officer. And in my final year at university, I did very little with the army, because I wanted to focus on my studies and get my final exams out of the way. It was in 1977 when I had continued my education with an attempt at doing a PhD that I missed the life, and I missed the action of the Territorial Army. And I decided to join the Yorkshire Volunteers as a private soldier, simply because I didn't really know yet whether I wanted the responsibility.
Now, I think your commanding officer had suspicions you were a fifth columnist or even a communist.
My degree was in politics, And I was doing a PhD on a political subject regarding, I forget the title. It was to do with European integration in any way, in any case. And I think Major Young's concern was, you know, why does this guy who's a university graduate want to join the TA as a private soldier? And he thought that I might be some kind of Bolshevik infiltrator who was, going to come and cause problems and try and turn the guys in the TA. But yeah, fortunately, there was the company 2IC. He'd also been with Sheffield OTC, and I had a friend who had gone on to get commissioned, and he was at that time with D Company. And they said, no, it's fine. He just doesn't want the responsibility at this moment. So that's why he just wants to be a private.
And what sort of mix were the other soldiers in that unit? What sort of background were they from?
Oh, they were working class lads. A lot of them were miners, many of them miners, because Barnsley was a big coal mining area back in the 70s. There was another corporal, very strong guy, and his job was working in a store and humping car batteries around all day. So he'd got a lot of strength in his arms. I remember that. I can't remember all their professions, but they were working class guys and very rough and ready. But I got on well with them. They thought that I was a bit of an odd fish as a university graduate, and sometimes there'd be attempts to rag me, but yeah, I showed that I could swing a fist, and that stopped. When I first joined, I was reporting at Encliffe Hall in Sheffield, and that was our base. But we were a detached platoon, and under a very nice platoon commander who became a good friend of mine. And then they reorganised it, and Encliffe Hall came under 1 Yorks, which had a NATO commitment and went on the big exercises in Germany. And I got the choice of shifting from 3 Yorks to 1 Yorks and attending Encliffe Hall in Sheffield, which Sheffield was where I lived, obviously, or of staying with 3 Yorks, but then I would have to go to Barnsley. So I felt very loyal to my company 2IC in particular, because he was an ex-Sheffield OTC man, and he'd really looked after me, and he was doing his best to train me and bring me up to be a good officer. And I felt very loyal to him, so I stuck with 3 Yorks. I said, as long as you can give me a lift over to Barnsley and back again, then I'm quite happy to stay with 3 Yorks. So we were staying with home defence. I remember doing one exercise only where we were practicing home defence of guarding a key point, which was a power station, and also of guard some barracks, which was one of the local barracks. But there seemed to be a little bit of confusion over our role, really, as regards the training, because most of our training was in section and platoon attacks of the type that I'd done as an Army Cadet and with the OTC, and that I'd trained for at Sandhurst, and not for home defence. There was very little discussion of knowledge of the local area and the local key points, which would have been telephone exchanges and power stations and the like, railway junctions. You'd think that there would have been the training for that, but there wasn't. And it left me and others rather concerned that in the event of war, what we would actually be doing would be shipped off to Germany as reinforcements, or to make up the casualty replacements in the front line there. And we were woefully unprepared for that. In fact, we were woefully unprepared in 3 Yorks for just about anything, in my opinion. For example, we had, in the company stores, we had our rifles, our SLRs, and we had the light machine guns, which were basically World War II vintage Bren guns converted to 7.62 caliber. I didn't mind the fact that we had Bren guns rather than GPMGs. They were £3 lighter, and I rather liked it as a weapon. I thought it was pretty nifty. I liked the SLR, and a lot of veterans still look back with great affection towards the SLR. We also had in the stores a Carl Gustav anti-tank weapon, 84mm caliber, and we had 2-inch mortar. Those, as far as I saw, never came out of the stores. Nobody was trained on them, so nobody in the company really knew how to use these weapons. Now, I'd fired 2-inch mortar on a couple of occasions, but not with the TA. I'd fired a sub-caliber round from a Carl Gustav once, but that was with the Army Cadets. In the TA, I never fired the anti-tank weapon, never fired the 66mm light anti-tank weapon. Can't remember ever firing the 2-inch mortar, because if we needed illumination rounds, we generally used Shimuli flares, which were rocket flares, which were certainly easier to use in an urban environment. But we never used the bigger weapons at our disposal, and I think that would have been a big drawback had we had to go to the front, because nobody knew how to fire an anti-tank weapon, and there's a bloody great T-62 coming at you. The other thing was that I found the training. My training wasn't too bad because I'd been to Sandhurst and I'd been to Warminster. But the training of the men was rather unimaginative and very routine. It was all a matter of march and shoot. But we didn't even shoot very well because you never got the same rifle twice from the stores. Now, what was supposed to happen was that you were supposed to have your own individual rifle, and this would be zeroed to your eye so that you could be confident of hitting the target first time. And this didn't happen. And we did go on a march and shoot, and I was part of the team that went on the march and shoot, and our shots were going everywhere. And I was watching where mine were landing, and I was trying to walk the rounds in to the falling plate targets. But of course, by the time you've done that and you've found the point where you need to aim for to get your round on the target, well, that set of falling plates is no longer relevant because there's another one coming up 100 meters closer to you. Yeah, I thought it was rather farcical in many ways, and it was a bit like Dad's army. We weren't very prepared for war, to be honest.
Did any of the training include crowd control or things like that? Because no. I would imagine the expectation was that CND would turn up or some other form of demonstration.
Yeah, that you would think so, but it wasn't. We didn't get any training in that. Nothing at all. And another thing regarding preparedness, a big aspect of warfare, or what we expected to happen in the 1970s, was the NBC factor, nuclear, biological and chemical. And it was fully expected that the Warsaw Pact would make wide use of various chemical agents, very nasty stuff, nerve agents and blistering agents and such like. We had one day when we were in what we called noddy suits, which is the full protective gear and respirators. And again, things hadn't been sorted out properly. We were all clean shaven, so it wasn't a case of beards getting in the way or anything. But we went into the gas tent, and Captain Bounds, Chris Bounds, he was there in his respirator, and he told us what we had to do. He was going to light a CS cartridge, chemical smoke, and we were just to sit there in our respirators while it built up, and then on order we were to take a deep breath, pull our respirators off, state our name, rank, and number, and then exit the tent. Well, the gas built up, the chemical smoke built up, and I could taste it. I could smell it, and it was starting to make me cough already. And so I said, hang on, Chris. I said, I don't think my respirator's working very well because I'm getting gas in. And he said, okay, you go first. So I stated my number, and second lieutenant, and went out with streaming eyes. And and that was a factor. Everybody came out with streaming eyes anyway, but my respirator wasn't fitted properly. And there'd been no effort made to make sure that it did fit properly. I'd done my best myself, but you'd think we would have had a dedicated instructor and some other method of testing it out than simply waiting until you were in the gas tent and then finding out that it didn't work. It could have been worse. We could have been at the front line and a nerve agent floating about and find out the hard way. So, that wasn't pretty good. Oh, an amusing story there, though. On that day, when we were all wandering about the camp after the gas tent episode, we were just sort of wandering around in our noddy suits with respirators on. And the next day, my Company 2IC said to me, "We've got the oddest order here." He said, "Colonel Ben wants us to wear rank insignia on our noddy suits." And they said this just goes against all current thinking. Nobody wore rank insignia in combat at all. You just expected to know who was in charge. And I put my hand to my face. I said, I think I might know the reason for that, sir. He said, "What's that?" I said, "Well, Sergeant Harding came up to me, laughing his head off, and said, 'Hey, sir, do you know what I've just done?' I said, 'What now?' And he said, 'Well, I saw this little figure wandering about, and I thought it were thee. I thought, there's Mr. Smith. So I put my arms round him from behind and bumped him up and down and said, 'Hey up, Mr. Smith, how's the going then?' And it were Colonel." He just done that to the Colonel. So that was why Colonel Ben wanted us all to wear rank insignia, so that everybody knew who everybody was when we were in these noddy suits.
I mean, being from a university background, did they try and push you onto certain courses or anything like that?
Well, I remember at the first camp that I attended, the first annual camp that I attended as a private soldier, and we had a sergeant major in the battalion who'd been an NCO with the Intelligence Corps. And he suggested that he might run a course for a week on intelligence and military intelligence. And so my Company 2IC, he put me up for that. So, he thought that I was a perfect candidate for that. So I spent a very pleasant week on that course talking about military intelligence and learning how to, all the tax signs that you put on the maps, how to denote infantry and mechanized infantry and armor and artillery and such like. And so about the weapons and capabilities of the Soviet forces arrayed against us. And we had a visit one day by the brigadier, and he came in and we all sat to attention, and then he told us to relax, and he said, "Well, remember that the enemy aren't all giants," he said, "but they're not dwarfs either. So just soldiers like you are, and learn about them and be ready to fight them." And that pretty much put things in perspective. They're soldiers like we are. There's just an awful lot more of them. That was the most frightening thing, really, was the Soviet ground forces were so much more numerous, and air forces. Just about everything they got was so much more numerous than the NATO forces.
Although you weren't to know at the time that perhaps the quality of them wasn't going to be necessarily as...
Well, this was brought out with the Afghan war, the Russo-Afghan war. And the fact that the Russians invaded Afghanistan, was it Christmas 1979? And they really just floundered there, and they couldn't beat the Mujahideen. And after 1990, after the Berlin Wall came down, and there was a subsequent coup, of course, when Yeltsin was in, and that coup was unsuccessful, but it came out that a lot of the Soviet equipment was there simply in name only. It was stored in sheds with fuel pipes rotting through and rusting and not really fit for service. So we realised later, or I realised later, that we were perhaps looking at fighting a paper tiger, but we weren't to know it at the time. And I think the Russians were probably a lot more frightened of us, in fact, than we were of them.
I think that the more I look into this subject, and particularly the examples we've seen in Ukraine as well, that, this Warsaw Pact steamroller coming over the border was not necessarily exactly what was going to happen. And certainly in the 80s, I think there was a high level of confidence amongst the British Army, particularly with the newer and lighter anti-tank weapons, that they would have given a really good account of themselves.
I expect they would, because it's very difficult to organise such a big operation as 7 days to the River Rhine would have been. Talking about hundreds of thousands of men and thousands of tanks and hundreds of aircraft. It's a very big deal to organise an operation like that and to keep it going, because even a company and battalion level, things can break down very quickly for lack of coordination. And so imagine how it must be at working things at army level or army group level. I can't even begin to think how it would be managed.
Not at all.
Big armies very often fail through history because they're just too big and unwieldy.
While you were in 3rd Yorks at these training camps, I mean, who was training you and drilling you? Was it people from the Territorials or from external units?
Oh gosh, we had the first camp that I went to when I was a private soldier. We were to have our colours presented to us at York Racecourse, and prior to that, because we all would be appearing as a battalion on York Racecourse with a huge audience, they brought a couple of drill instructors over from the Coldstream Guards. And so my first week was spent learning about military intelligence, and the entire second week was spent doing drill and very little else. And they got us up to a very high standard of drill, I've got to say, and was very educational, but rather boring in the end. But the lads didn't seem to mind it because we were in Scarborough. So they were out on the town every night, because there was very little going on by way of night exercises or anything like that. If anything, we'd just be bulling our boots and polishing our buttons and just keeping our uniforms ready. But generally, after 6 o'clock, everybody would be pulling jeans and t-shirt on and heading down the town and getting gloriously drunk. So that was a week of sustained drill, and I have to say that we came off pretty well. Oh, there was a bit of a mutiny because there was some doubt about how many were actually to be present actually on the racecourse when the colours were presented. And at first they said they just wanted a colour party, but then all the rest said, well, if we don't go on after all this drilling for a week, I'm resigning. So they had to rescind that and have the whole battalion on instead. Having said that, the whole battalion, I mean, a battalion in those days was, if I remember rightly, about 730 men. And we never saw that kind of numbers out. I think we were probably in about company strength, company and a half, when all said and done. Because you never saw all the guys who'd signed up to join the TA. You understand? we'd have a recruiting week, and maybe you'd get 40 new recruits. And within a few weeks, you'd only have about a dozen of those still coming. And when there was the annual camp, if it looked like being an arduous one, there'd be a lot to say, oh, I'm not going to bother attending this, because there was simply no compulsion. The duty on the face of it was to attend one drill night per month, 2 weeks at annual camp per year, and I think 2 weeks on some other course during the year, which isn't very much really. Now, I did a lot more than that. I used to attend 3 or even 4 drill nights per month because I was keen, and there were others who did that too, and I was only too glad to go on any courses that were available. But I did say to the company commander one day, I said, "Sir, we may have the numbers on paper, but if the Cold War goes hot and we have to turn out and fight the Russians, then we aren't going to have the men to do it, because we're only going to be able to field a platoon perhaps instead of a full company." And he was quite dismissive of this. "Oh, don't worry about that. All these guys who joined up and decided they don't want to be part of it anymore, and they don't turn up, oh, we'll send the MPs round and collect them, and we'll put them through a week's training, and then they'll be on the boat or the plane over to Germany. Don't you worry about that." Which I found very unconvincing. You can't. We're seeing it in the Ukraine now. You can't send guys out with a week's training and expect them to be any good in the field. That's just ridiculous.
I think you said 3rd Yorkshire was designated as a home defence battalion, so
Yeah.
you're in theory up against Spetsnaz and 5th columnists and stuff like that.
Yes, yeah. There was that was the nominal role of 3 Yorks when I was in. Which meant that we never got the chance to go to Germany and join the big exercises, which was a shame, because it would have been a wonderful experience, I think, to look back on. But it fitted in quite well with my own concept that I was there to be part of Britain's home. Now, I don't know if you've ever been a soldier yourself, but as a private soldier, when the dog thinks and its tail wags, you're right at the end of the tail. You're flapping about most. And there was one morning at annual camp when we got turned out, and I think the order was shirt sleeved order. So we turned out in that order. Stood on parade. The order came, "No, we've got it wrong. You need to be in full number 2 dress." So we all ran inside again and got into number 2 dress, turned out again. And that again was countermanded, and it was to be pull-over order. So we ran inside, got out of number 2 dress, put our olive greens on and our pullovers and shirts and pullovers, of course, and turned out again. And I was getting pretty sick of this. If there'd been hazing us, which is part of your training, I could have understood it, but this was just sheer bad coordination and incompetence. And I thought, well, I've got all the qualifications really to be an officer. Let's be an officer, because at least I'll be so many ranks up the ladder, and I'll make my way towards the base of the dog's tail. I won't be wagging as widely as I would be as a private soldier. And that was when I decided to go for the commission. The decision to put me up for a commission was taken very quickly. It was taken at the same annual camp, and I was designated as a potential officer. But although I spent the rest of the annual camp as a private soldier, but when we went back on our first training evening after that, I got the white slides to put on my epaulets, and I was designated as an officer cadet. So that would have been, let's see, autumn 1977, and there was further training, several courses that I went on, and I eventually went up to Sandhurst in May 1978. Now, a Territorial Army officer in those days mainly trained with his parent company and battalion. And the 2 weeks that you did at Sandhurst were really just the final crunch of training to try and cram everything into you, and for assessment to see whether you were really up to it. So at Sandhurst, in those 2 weeks, they put an awful lot of pressure on you, and if you make the grade, which most of us did.
And when you get through, what are the next steps then for you?
Well, the first training evening that we had back at Barnsley, which was where my company was, at the end of the evening, we went up to the bar, and the company commander made an announcement to all and sundry and said that Officer Cadets Smith and Rimon are now second lieutenants. So he said, let's take these tatty old white slides off your shoulders and put your first pip up. So we ceremonially decorated us with our first stars as second lieutenants, and then it was our round, drinks all round for everybody, and that was it really. And I think it was gazetted in the London Gazette, but I never saw a copy of that.
How did you feel at that moment that you are now a commander of men, albeit a platoon?
Well, there was elation at having got that far, clearly, but you also awareness that you've still got an awful lot to learn, and it still takes an effort to really become a leader of men. And I think it took me until the end of my subsequent annual camp to really achieve that. And there was just a certain point in time when it clicked. And of course, being an officer cadet in a company where you've previously been a private is an invidious position, because everybody's known you as a private soldier. They all know you by your first name, and they want to carry on calling you by your first name and not sir, which is what they're supposed to do. And of course, you tend to get ribbed and ragged by the NCOs. And an NCO can pretty much say anything he likes to you as long as he attaches sir to it. You're a right idiot, sir, and that kind of thing. And really, it takes some effort and willpower and gaining of self-confidence to give orders to people who used to be in command of you as corporals and sergeants. So, yeah, it took me a little while to grasp that, but I got it. There came a point when some of the other ranks just went a bit too far, and I really put my foot down and started to act like an officer, and then I saw how easy it was. Act like an officer, and they'll treat you like one. So,
and the survival rate of second lieutenants is not great in wartime. Was that sort of in your mind as well?
Yes, it was. We used to actually joke about it that if the balloon went up and the Cold War went hot and we were sent to the front line, that our life expectancy was about 20 minutes. And we joked about it, but we were young then, and crikey, young men do tend to be a little bit insouciant about this kind of thing. They, you always think it's going to happen to somebody else and never to you. And when you think of going into action and you're aware that you might quite possibly die in action, but you never think about the possibility of getting horribly wounded. And that's only something that goes through your mind later on in life, after you've become a father and a family man. And when you've got children of your own, gosh, I think I might not have just have been taken out by a bullet to the head or the heart. I might have got my balls blown off, or I might have got half my face blown away and still survived. Or, some brain injury which would have horribly impaired my mental capacity. Those things never went through our heads. Among all the young officers there, we simply didn't think about it, and that's why war is a young man's business. You really can't be thinking about that kind of thing, otherwise you'd never go.
I guess you sort of think, oh, it's not going to happen to me.
Yeah, exactly. It's always going to be the other guy, and reading accounts of the Second World War and the casualties that they took in Normandy, it's quite frightening, really. I remember reading one account where one young lieutenant counted himself lucky after an attack on the German lines because he'd got 14 men still left in his platoon. And that's out of a platoon of 38, as it was in those days. So that's a huge casualty rate, but he counted himself lucky that he got 14. And he was, I think, one of the only officers still standing from his company.
Wow. I had a great uncle who was a second lieutenant during World War One, and I think he lasted 6 weeks and he was killed.
Gosh.
And high casualty rates, particularly then.
The thing is, as an officer, you have to stick your neck out, and when an attack goes in, you have to be leading it. You can't sit back and let your men go in. You've got to lead from the front. I mean, not exactly be the first man at the front, but certainly with the first section in your platoon. And you're the guy who's perhaps gesturing and calling to people, and also you've got your radio operator with you who's got this long whip aerial which stands out a mile. So all an enemy sniper's got to do is look for the guy next to the radio operator and shoot him, and look for the guy who's making all the gestures and shouting the orders. And so you're an obvious target as an officer.
Being an officer, what are the benefits of that?
Well, you got your own room as often as not, or you were sharing it with maybe one or two other officers instead of being in a big billet like the men were on camp. The discipline regarding room tidiness and that kind of thing was much more relaxed. You weren't expected to go through all this boxing your blankets kind of crap, and so that was easier. Yeah, you got to go to the regimental and battalion dinners and such like, which were quite pleasant and fun. I could never afford the proper mess dress. I was a student at the time, so I was on a shoestring, and you only got about £50 clothing allowance, which I spent the whole of that on my service dress. So yes, I could never afford the posh-looking scarlet mess dress. Yeah, those were the benefits of it. One benefit that you certainly didn't get as a humble second lieutenant was extra pay, because the first time that I got my pay slip, the money had been paid into my bank account, and I looked in horror and confusion. And when I saw that my pay had hardly gone up at all from when I was a private, so a second lieutenant gets paid pretty much the same as a private first class. Your corporals are getting better paid than you, and the sergeants certainly are. And I think that's pretty unfair. I did look up pay scales for as they were in, I think, 1914, and what they are today in the army. And in 1914, a new officer would, without doubt, be earning twice as much as a private soldier. Although, of course, in those days, you were expected to have a private income as well to, and supply a lot of your own kit. But now the pay differentials have been eroded so much that anybody joining the army as an officer certainly doesn't do so for the pay. And I wouldn't have done it for the pay either. I did it simply because I enjoyed it. Getting the pay was nice, but I did it for the enjoyment.
And how long were you in the Territorials for?
Not very long, actually. I was with the OTC from 73 nominally to 76. I was in the Territorials from 77 through 78, mainly because when I was at Sandhurst in May 78, I think I cracked a disc in my spine because I was running along with the radio, and those radios were very heavy. I think they weighed about 15 kilograms. And I was trying to be keen and keep up with the nominated platoon commander. And I didn't see a sudden hollow in the ground. And it was only a few inches, but my leg went in at full lock, and I got a terrible jarring that went up from my heel right to the nape of my neck, and it was incredibly painful. But I didn't want to be Mardy, so I just carried on. And that didn't really show up until about 6 months later in October. And I was taking a year's leave of absence for study in Italy and wanting to keep fit for when I went back. I was going out running, and one day I got terrible sciatic pains shooting down my leg. I tried to run through it and couldn't. And the next time I got back to England at Christmas, I was sleeping and got up one morning, I could barely get out of bed. My back was so sore. And unfortunately, that pretty much put paid to my short career as an army officer. And I didn't get that back problem really sorted out until my mid-30s, when I saw an osteopath who had the magic touch and relieved me of the problem.
Wow. Wow. Did you miss not being in the Territorials after?
Yes, very much. Because I ended up working in the Netherlands, and I'd met my wife in Italy, and she was Dutch, my future wife, and so I went to the Netherlands and I worked there, and I wish I'd been given the option of training with the Dutch Reserve Forces. So I did rather miss it. But yeah, it didn't happen. Later on, I thought of joining that. What was it? There was.
I think it was the Home Service Force.
I thought of joining that, and just about the time when I'd made my mind up that I might want to join it, they were winding it up. It didn't last very long at all. So it didn't last very long anyway.
Yeah, I've got an episode where it's an interview with an officer who served in the Home Service Force. I'll put a link into the episode information for that. When we've been talking, you sound quite disillusioned about the sort of like poor equipment and the poor management of your unit.
Yeah.
Did that leave you disillusioned with the army?
No, not with the army as a whole. And I can't speak for the other battalions, of course. There was 1st and 2nd Battalion had a NATO commitment, and yeah, they did get to play with the big stuff and run about in armoured personnel carriers and such like. But not our battalion. As I say, it just seemed to be our battalion, 3 Yorks, at that time. Might have got better after I left, I don't know. But at that time, there seemed to be a bit of confusion about what our actual role was and what we were actually to train for. So I think that if we could have trained better if people had made their minds up. You know, if we were to make their minds up that we were to go to Germany, train for that. If we're just to stand around at key points and defend them against Spetsnaz, train for that, or do as you said yourself, crowd control. That would have been very useful. But we didn't do that. Yeah, it's just left me. It didn't leave me disillusioned with the army or military life. It just left me disillusioned with that battalion.
How do you feel when you look back on it now in 2024?
I'm glad that I did it because it was a very forming part of my life. Eventually, I did get that, as it were, a leader of men, even though that was pretty much right at the end of my active period. And So it was formational for me. It was enjoyable. I liked the exercise, even though I did knacker my back doing it. But it was very enjoyable, and it showed me that I could do a lot more than I ever thought I could before. One thing that I haven't touched on, the hardest part about it, I thought, was sleep deprivation. And that's part and parcel of life on exercise and certainly in combat. You can go as 3 days with hardly any sleep, and the first 48 hours are the hardest. But after that, somehow your body seems to get used to it. Although you can then fall asleep at the drop of a hat without even knowing that you've fallen asleep. Yeah, I think that was about the hardest part of it, more so than the running around.
I struggle staying awake now, but not talking to you, but just getting older, getting older, and finding myself nodding off.
I need my naps now. I'm nearly 70, so.
Now, in your notes, you did mention a conversation you had with a friend of yours about PTSD.
We got together because he'd been out to Iraq, and I'd been one of the few people who kept in touch with him using the Army's Bluey system, and wrote letters to him, and I was getting handwritten Blueys back from him. And then, an old fellow of ours died of cancer, and so in order to drink to his memory, I think it was my only visit to the Officers Club. And on the way there, I asked him about PTSD. And I said, sort of, how big a problem is this? He said, oh, it's real. It's very real. He said, I've got it. I said, really? He said, yeah. He said, you find the noise of a fridge door closing, and it goes, boom. And you find yourself on the floor because it brings back the noise of a RPG coming in. He said, or waking up at night and thinking that you've heard machine gun fire. And he said, and unlike the regular army, you don't get any help with this as a terrier. You just expected to say, thank you very much, off you go back to your day job. And it was only on a drill night when he heard some of his NCOs talking about this in a little group, and he happened to be passing and heard them talking, and he joined in the conversation. And they exchanged experiences, and he said, miraculously then, the worst of it wore off, and the PTSD got better after that, simply by virtue of talking about it and exchanging experiences with others. It's knowing that it's not just you, and it's not a weakness. It's something that happens to everybody.
Don't miss the episode extras such as videos, photos and other content. Just look for the link in the podcast information. The podcast wouldn't exist without the generous support of our financial supporters, and I'd like to thank one and all of them for keeping the podcast on the road. The Cold War conversation continues in our Facebook discussion group. Just search for Cold War Conversations in Facebook. Thanks very much for listening, and see you next week.